We'll see if we can get this to work. All right, guys, sorry for the delay. Where is everyone tonight?
The weather and the hurricane.
The hurricane's not till like when?
That's it. It's
Freaking hurricane. That's all I need in my life. With everything I've been dealing with.
Better rush out and get some bread and milk.
bread and milk.
What's that?
Better rush out and get some bread and milk. That's what
Yes.
it's a
Or
tradition.
hightail it to Pennsylvania.
It's a tradition.
That's what I'd be doing.
You think I should fly, go to Pennsylvania?
I think you should drive and hang out there for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I had that option, I'd go.
All right, here we go. I'll pass this sign-in sheet around. If you guys are down with it, give us your name, phone number, email. If we have a newsletter that goes out, and I would have just went out last week. So if you've signed up for that and you're not getting our newsletter, you got to let us know, and we'll try to get that fixed. If we can't read your email, and we put your email in wrong, obviously we don't. We get a lot of bounce backs in those situations. I know you guys are under a lot of stress and a lot of duress, but write nice and neat so that we can read it and all that good stuff. If you haven't been here before and you're not familiar with Favor, if I can introduce myself real quick. My name is Rich Jones. I'm the CEO here at Favor Greenville. A little bit about my background. I'm a person in long-term recovery, first and foremost. My story is there were a lot of different substances involved, a lot of different behaviors, that kind of thing. I certainly wasn't innocent by any means, but in 1999 I was in a car accident and I started to get prescribed opioids. I walked out of the emergency room that day with 120 Darvocet, and it was sort of like game on from there. And my life kind of fell apart within a year and a half. I was in recovery. And then I'm also a clinician. I went back to school, became a therapist, and got a bunch of different certifications. That's what all these different letters are. That's just how you got to roll. You got to get different letters after your name if you want to be able to do this type of stuff in different states. And I've run a lot of different clinical programs. I've run outpatient programs, inpatient programs, community mental health, that type of stuff. I've been here at Favor for about 5 years. Favor's a different program. It's a recovery support program. Our goal is to provide information, support, encouragement, system navigation. We want to hold your hand as you're dealing with this with your loved one. We want to help your loved one find if you need services. We provide meetings. We provide intervention support, all of the above. And tonight, this group is meant to be kind of a lecture, sort of an informational session. This isn't meant to replace any kind of therapy that you're involved in. So if you're involved in another program, keep going to that program. If you're talking to other people, keep talking to other people. This is just our take, and I'm going to give you some information. It's my view of the world, if you will. There are a lot of different views on addiction. You're going to hear a lot of different opinions, a lot of different ideas around this. And that's cool. People are entitled to their opinion. They're all wrong. That was completely inappropriate for me to say. But no, in all seriousness, it gets really interesting, and it gets kind of like, it can get contentious around these issues. You'll hear people give parents, for example. Parents will get a wide variety of advice in these areas. One thing, for example, parents will be told is, you're enabling your child to death. You're babying your child. They're going to die. Kick them out. Get rid of them. Get them out of the house. Don't even give them a bologna sandwich. For whatever reason, that seems to be a cliche that's used. I don't get that at all. Who the hell really wants a bologna sandwich? And so we have a different take on the world. Of course, there are situations where that's needed, right? There are situations where you're going to get to a point where there are some hard boundaries that need to be set. What are those situations? It has a lot to do with how long you've been dealing with this. It has a lot to do with whether or not the person is abusive in any kind of way. It has a lot to do with whether or not the person's stealing from you in any kind of way. There are going to be circumstances where you have to do that to preserve your own sanity, right? But that doesn't mean that's the answer across the board. And that's sort of how we want to approach it here at Favor. We want to try to explore these issues, answer these questions. Now, I will tell you this, in almost every circumstance that I've dealt with, there are things that the family can start to do different that will impact themselves, that will help themselves with their stress level, but will also impact the other person's behavior. Because we believe a family is a system, and if you change one part, you change all parts. So, more than likely, there are things that you can do, things that you can start to do different. Now, does anybody in the audience have any topic that they want to talk about tonight? I was going to talk about this idea of codependency, traumatic grief, that kind of thing. But does anybody have anything that they're dealing with that they would like to, make sure that we cover tonight? I'm taking requests. I'm like a DJ. Come on out there. Anybody got anything? If not, that's fine. We can go with mine. Yes.
Okay, so this is my first night here.
Okay, welcome.
I'm a sibling of an addict,
Oh, okay.
and I'm having a real hard time figuring out where I'm in the gray area. What's the difference between compassionate and enabling?
Yes. So we'll talk about that tonight, and I think it's very unique and kind of a little bit difficult with siblings, because when they come to this group, sometimes what they hear me say, they feel like I'm too soft. They'll feel like I'm too soft sometimes, because it's so hard to watch what goes on with your parents when you have a sibling going through this. I did. I've been right in your shoes, and I wanted to resort to settling this via violence on any given day at any given time. So it's very tough for siblings. I will try to answer your question, and I'll try to tailor it. I will tell you though that your take on it will be a little bit different than everyone else probably in the room. It's so unique. At one point we started a group for siblings, and and then it just kind of fizzled out, that kind of thing. But I feel like some of the information we give you tonight will help you get clarity. The issue is, when is it enabling? There's a fine line between enabling and support, that kind of thing. There's a fine line, and sometimes it can get strange, and people will get to don't understand why mom and dad continue to pay the rent, don't understand why mom and dad continue to pay the car payment, that kind of thing. Definitely get frustrated and angry with the way the addicted person treats mom and dad. That is 100% part of the process and part of the, and then I would encourage you to share and ask questions as we go through. I think some of what we talk about will definitely help with that. Part of it is, how can we get in touch with this idea of addiction as a disease? And this is where we'll start. We start every week with this process. Remember last week when we talked, or last time we talked, that not everybody abusing substances is actually addicted. This is an important point. We have different programs, and people walk into programs, and we tend to treat everybody the same. So when somebody comes to a program, we tend to paint with a broad brush, and we encourage people to what? Follow the program, do the program, listen to what your sponsor has to say, listen to what your coach has to say, listen to what your therapist has to say. But there's a reality, is not every single person using substances and not every single person using substances dangerously are actually addicted. This is the statistical breakdown of this matter. There are about 32% of Americans 12 and over are using at what's considered a risky level. So it's still dangerous and something bad could happen. And then about 16% are using at an addicted level. And I'm going to talk about the brain issue, and maybe this will help you understand what's going on with your siblings around the person who's crossed the line into addiction. Now, I don't want to ignore people who are using at a risky level. I don't want to ignore that at all. If you come into Favor, we're going to try to help you no matter what. We actually don't diagnose people with Favor, so we don't even bother with that. There is no, if Julia comes in and we sit down and we try to examine what she has going on and give her a label and then put her in a certain group, we don't do that. So we're going to try to help you no matter what. But I think it's good for family members and for loved ones, spouses, parents, siblings, to really understand and try to figure out, what do we think we're dealing with in our family? This gets really, really most confusing around certain substances. So let's just go through some substances. If your loved one is using heroin, if your loved one is using a lot of pills, if they're using methamphetamine or cocaine, that kind of stuff, those substances get to the point where I don't know that there actually is recreational use. Does that make sense to everybody in the room? Like, that gets a little bit harder to say that this is just at a recreational level, that kind of thing. I think where alcohol is concerned, this definitely gets squirrely, right? You know, when you go to this perspective where alcohol is concerned, you can definitely find a lot of people who you're like, I don't know where they fall. In today's world, marijuana falls into that, because remember, marijuana comes from the earth. Okay? And it's legal in certain states, and it's medicine in certain states, so it's not even a drug anymore, Rich. It comes from the earth, like a goat or an apple. I had a kid tell me that once. I want you guys to think about that for a minute. How would you handle that if you were sitting in a therapy session with a kid, and they said, like, it comes from the earth, like a goat or an apple? It may have been one of the strangest conversations I've ever had in my life. I said, can you smoke a goat? I know you can smoke an apple, but can you smoke a goat? Come on, guys, loosen up. Work with me on this. What I'm going to give you tonight is information, and you can't even make that decision for your loved one. Does everyone understand where I'm coming? They have to make that decision. A clinician would have to sit down with them. Somebody sits down with them, goes through it, that kind of thing. But you know, you may instinctually know what you're dealing with. And again, depending on what the substances are, opioids would be, you know, just a really good example. It gets very hard to get to a situation where you're just recreationally using opioids. Has everything to do, if you want to know, you know, how does this stuff go down? Why does this happen? Why does this happen to certain people? Why did this happen to my sibling? Why did this happen to my son, my daughter, that kind of thing? The biggest predictor is age of first use. We talk about this a lot. It bears repeating. How old you are when you first start messing around with this stuff has everything to do with it. If you talk to people in treatment centers, the average age of first use is around 14 years old. Your brain is still developing. That's what that's all about. You flood it with all these chemicals, you're beating it up, and your brain is still developing. It's a healthcare issue, guys. This is not a moral issue. It's not a sin. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to ruin your day. It moves to a point where the compulsive use and the compulsive behavior is running the show. And that's not to make an excuse for anybody. That's not to make an excuse for the siblings or anybody who's taking advantage of another person, but that's the reality of the situation. And then obviously the earlier we intervene, the better. And this is just an image. This is a PET scan that's trying to illustrate the change in the brain. This may be most useful for people who are first here. Maybe this is your first group or you're early on in this process and you may not quite understand what your loved one's dealing with. So what you have is you have the depletion of dopamine, and it happens over time. So over time, you flood your brain with dopamine again and again and again and again. And for some of us, what happens is the brain responds by shutting off the production of dopamine, because too much dopamine repetitively is dangerous. The analogy would be with diabetes type 2. You give it to yourself, you put things in your body, over time, the pancreas stops producing insulin. I gave it to myself. I wasn't born with it. Type 1 I'm born with. Everyone agree with that? Because the other thing people say about addiction is you gave it to yourself, Rich. You did it to yourself. Well, there are a lot of diseases that we actually have given to ourselves. Would you guys agree? There's a lot of diseases that our behavior contributes to. And in this case, when dopamine is shut off, when the production of dopamine is shut off, what it leads to that compulsive seeking of the substance. It leads to all the things whenever you're using and you don't know, against your better judgment. You're using despite clear consequences. You're hurting the people around you. You're hurting people you love. You're putting your job at jeopardy. You're putting your freedom at jeopardy. You're putting your children at jeopardy because it has taken on a different tone. So this, guys, is much different than, let's see here, than this, okay? But it can look the same. If you go, and we, those of us who are needing recovery, we want to fall here, right? We don't necessarily want to use that word, addicted. We don't want to use, which is part of the problem, because that word comes with so much baggage that it keeps people from seeking help. Because addicted implies what? I have to change everything. I can't use anything. I have to go to those meetings. I have to go to rehab. There's all these messages that society have told us about this issue. That's why, people don't want to talk about it over here. Maybe we'll talk about this. The truth is, people don't even talk about this. The unfortunate truth is, we don't really talk about this issue at all until we have to. What would make us have to? We drive the car into a tree. We get arrested. We get the kids taken away from us. We are forced to have the conversation. But does anybody have any questions on what's going on in the brain, or anything that I can clear up before we move on does anyone want to talk about this? Does anyone think this is BS? It's okay to think it's BS. A lot of people do. A lot of people don't buy this. There are a lot of people out there who say, but this is an actual image. This is true stuff. Something is different over here than over here. So no matter how you want to label, whether you want to call it a disease or a disorder or whatever you want to call it, can you kind of get in touch, if you're sitting out there and you just learn about this, can you get in touch that something different is going on? Something's happened that's different than, just, hey, I can put this down anytime, I'm compulsively using, I'm chasing it. That's what we want to get you in touch with. And the reason is, not so you can give an excuse for your loved one's behavior, so that you can completely 100% understand what you're dealing with. Because if you're dealing with somebody whose brain has changed, if you're dealing with somebody who has no rational thinking, you're not going to be able to go home tonight and debate them into recovery. You're not going to be able to, you probably aren't even going to be able to go home tonight and threaten them into recovery. Because cause and effect isn't working. You guys get this? Cause and effect isn't working. 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 when you're in this state of mind. 2 plus 2 equals 18. And if you give me long enough, we'll explain it. Because on Mondays, if you're left-handed, you add 14 to the equation, and then you get 18. And you'll be like, well, what's that all about? And then give me some time, I'll get you to believe that. And that's what's going on. But any questions or comments or thoughts on this part of the process? Anything I can clear up? All right. How do you know whether a person's dealing with it? This is about as close as we get. This is the diagnostic criteria. Tolerance, more and more. Withdrawal, you don't have it, you get sick. Craving, preoccupation, you think about it all the time. Can't control. You were going to have 3 drinks, you had 33 drinks. Can't cut back. I'm only going to drink on the weekends, but it's football season. I got to drink on Monday nights. You can't stick to your own rules. Interpersonal issues. People are angry at you about this issue. You avoid non-using activities. You really only want to go where the party is. Great deal of time spent on using. It's a full-time job. Physical or psychological dangers. You ignore those. You've been told something about your liver. You continue to drink. Use in physically hazardous situations. Repetitive drinking and driving. Role failure. You can't go to work. You can't go to school. If you meet 6 of those criteria in any given year, if you have a pattern of that behavior, you technically meet criteria for substance use disorder severe. The word addiction doesn't even appear in this process. So it's really not called addiction, it's called substance use disorder severe. Alcohol use disorder severe, opioid use disorder, whatever it may be. So any questions about this?
Tolerance means that you need more and more of the substance.
More and more to get the same effect.
And that includes alcohol.
That includes alcohol. Alcohol is a really good example of tolerance. A lot of people will drink. We'll just use beer as an example. Maybe they'll drink 3 or 4 beers, and then all of a sudden it becomes a 6-pack, and then all of a sudden it becomes a 12-pack. Your body acclimates to you putting these chemicals in, and it just takes more and more to get the same desired effect. And it happens. This can happen. These first 2 can happen to a person without the person being addicted. It can happen without all of this. This is a physical part of the process. Does that make sense? This is a 100. Your body, you guys, if you take a certain substance, or you just start taking. If you have surgery and you start taking pain pills, you will develop a tolerance, and you will go through withdrawal, regardless of whether or not you go through these other behaviors. So that's important to note. Any other questions or thoughts?
Can I ask something?
Yes.
You were talking about the earlier they use, the more apt they are
Yes.
Is there any genetic component to any of this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Yes, absolutely. So the genetic component is it's about 40 to 60% more likely for you to develop this problem if it's in your family. But it's not the number one predictor.
The number one is the age.
The number one is age, and then the others are genetic components, and then obviously the drugs that you're using. There are different drugs that are more addictive than other drugs, that kind of thing. And then it also has to do with co-occurring mental health or personality issues, or however you want to say that. There are some people that are more vulnerable. Trauma also feeds into that. There's an interesting part of the equation that's around this idea of reward potential, and that some people are more at risk to become addicted based on the payoff for using. Does that make sense? So let's say that I have suffered a very serious trauma as a child. Something happened to me, maybe I was repetitively abused or repetitively sexually abused or whatever. And the only time I stop thinking about this, or the only time I can sleep through the night, is when I take these certain pills or I use this certain substance. Do you see how that reward potential is different for the person who didn't experience that? So that person is more at risk to wind up becoming addicted. There's a bigger payoff for it. You get more out of it. Everybody uses substances, guys, or let me rephrase that. Everybody uses substances the second time because what? It's a pleasurable experience. I mean, if it would have been like getting tasered the first time I used, I probably wouldn't be standing up here in front of you. Do you know what I mean? Like it just didn't go down that way. So it's a pleasurable experience that has some. You guys can come on in. Just come on in and grab a seat wherever you can. That's all right, no problem. So it's a pleasurable experience. For some people, it's a higher level of a payoff. And then obviously the substance, as you put it in your body over and over again, it'll start to change. All right, so let's talk about some stuff related to what the families can do. So I think we talked about this 2 weeks ago as well. We started to talk about boundaries. And when you talk about family recovery, whether you're talking about a hardcore situation where you're gone, don't even get a bologna sandwich, or whether you talk about we just need to start to do something different, it all comes down to boundaries. There's two aspects to family recovery. One is, what can I do for my loved one? That's a big part of the process. When people come to Favor Greenville, we acknowledge that. We know that that's part. We're going to help you try to figure out if you can do anything with your loved one. So that's one part of it, right? What can I do? And that's all about boundaries. And then the second part is what? What can I do for myself? Now, what if I told you boundaries also have to do for what you can do for yourself? Like how I set that up? That was well done, right? Well played. You thought I was going to, roll with that. Yeah, so boundaries actually fall into both categories. Because boundaries will do two things. It will influence the other person's behavior, but the second part is it'll help keep you sane. You'll start to be able to feel better, sleep better, be better if you start to work on this. And so that's what this is all going to be about. And boundaries, oops, I'm going the wrong way. No, I'm not. Sorry. All right. So there's personal boundaries and team boundaries. I think we talked about that last time. If you're in a family situation, and let's just talk about a situation where you're the sibling, there are going to be the boundaries that you have as a sibling, and then there are also going to be the boundaries that the parents have. There are personal boundaries, and those could be different. And then there are also team boundaries, and team boundaries start to come into play when you start to think about doing things like interventions, and you start to really think about doing something to what? Force the person to make a move. Do you guys get that? Any one of you, no matter what your circumstances is, whether or not your loved one is on the same page, whether or not they have other people in their life who support their using, any one of you can start setting personal boundaries tonight. You can start thinking of things that I want to be different in my relationship with the person that you can implement. Now, if you want to try to do an intervention, or if you want to try to get the person into some type of recovery, or you really feel like, we need to do something to change this, this is where you're going to have to get on the same page as a team. Any questions about that part of the process? Team boundaries and personal boundaries. You can have different personal boundaries, but if you're trying to do something as an intervention team or as a family meeting, you all got to be on the same page, even if somebody's going to have to fake it. That's logical stuff, right? That's like anything else. Let's just take parenting, for example. With any kind of parenting approach, mom and dad have to be on the same page. If if in theory this happened, if in theory my wife said before she was leaving the house for the day, if she said to my children, you can play video games for an hour and a half, and then I said, you can play video games all day, in theory. That would be what? That's not presenting a unified front, and they're going to think what? That either one of us, both of us, lose our validity in that situation. Because we're setting a boundary, it's a parenting boundary, it's a team boundary, we both have to be on the same page. Same thing where addiction and recovery is concerned. The stakes might be higher, the situation might be more volatile, it may feel dangerous, it may be completely out of control, but you have to have the same approach whenever you go in and have the conversation with the person. I think we talked about this. There are two main ways to influence a person financially. Are you controlling the purse strings? Are you paying for anything? Can you make some changes there that might motivate the situation? Or emotionally. Now, believe it or not, emotional leverage is just as powerful as financial leverage. Emotional leverage is how much time you're going to spend with the person, how much you want to be around the person, because being around them is so frustrating. It makes you so sad, it makes you so angry that you're deciding to step back. And these are kind of the two categories that boundaries fall into. And boundaries are for you. They're to help you. They're to protect you. They're your expectations for yourself. They're not to control another person. So any questions about that part of the framework? Because we're going to build out from this, but it doesn't get any more complicated than that. Here's what happens, guys. You're going to be in situations, you're going to be in these situations over and over again. And the person's going to struggle. It's going to come with it. There's no magic solution. They may go to rehab. They may stumble after rehab. They may do well for a while and then stumble. You're going to be faced with these things over and over again. And I'm telling you, if you can get the basics around boundary setting, it's probably the most important skill that you can get in this process. And when people call and say, Rich, what should I do? It's typically not, at least like after they're with us for a while, it's really not what should I do? Because you know what you should do. It's how do I do it? Do you guys get that? Because I'm telling you, like, there is no secret sauce. There is no unspoken information or magic solution to this process that we haven't disclosed or that we haven't turned over yet. You're in a tough situation with a chronic disease. With a chronic disease that unfortunately also lapses or slips can be part of that process. And learning where you can influence the person, how you're willing to use that influence, and learning how to say no when you decide to say no is going to be the key part of the process. Any questions about that or thoughts? Does that make sense? Yes?
How do you know when to stop helping financially?
Yeah. That's a great question. The question was, how do you know when to actually stop helping financially? So there are a couple guidelines we have. It depends on what you're helping with. So you'll hear this phrase at Favor Greenville. We have our own slogans. So I'm going to sling some slogans here. And a phrase, we'll support you in your recovery, but we won't support you in your addiction. So what you'll find is people usually take a little longer if they're supporting a person in a recovery process. So let's say, for example, a person's in a recovery house would be a perfect example. We tend to say stick that out maybe a little longer than you would if you're paying the rent and they're not in a recovery process. So, but they're all very individualized decisions, guys. And all the logical stuff comes into some of these financial circumstances. It depends on how long you've been supporting the person as well. You're probably going to stick it out a lot longer if this is brand new. If you feel like you've had this same conversation, we've been on this merry-go-round before, then you probably start to have other discussions. Now people will say, let's just talk about a job, for example. When can I expect my loved one to get a job, start paying their own way, that kind of thing, take care of themselves? There is no right or wrong answer to that. If a person's been to rehab, which a rehab would be typically, 30 days. Let's just say for argument they've been in a program for 30 days. Physically they're probably cleared and they're okay. And I would say technically when they come out, they could handle a low pressure kind of job right from the jump. the program that they go into in a recovery housing situation is probably going to have some expectations and say, nah, we really don't want you running around out there. We're going to keep you closed for a while. Maybe like another 2 weeks, maybe another 30 days. So now you get to that like 60-day mark. I would say that that's reasonable for a person to get back in the swing of things. I don't know that they need to go work 80 hours. Do you guys get that? But maybe they can start back and they can get a job and they can start contributing to the process. Does anyone else have any experience or feedback or opinions on that? Because I also want to emphasize, Jane, that there's no right or wrong answer to that. Do you guys get this? Like, I'm kind of giving you guidelines, but the details are very, very important. The person's situation and who he is or she, like as a person, has a lot to do with it. Age has a lot to do with it. So I'm throwing out some ideas, but I don't want you to think that there's a hard and fast rule around that. Yes?
Our daughter just came back from a facility in New Jersey.
Okay.
She was there for 28 days. 26,
It
28.
usually, yeah.
She was going to go to sober living there. That was our option. So she could learn to kind of get back out slowly into
Yep.
society and take on pressure and like in
In a supportive environment.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. They didn't quite get her on the wait list in time, so she had to come home.
Okay.
So we put her in the Carolina Center for her PHP and IOP program.
Yep.
She was ready to get a job. She had been clean. She'll be clean 90 days next week. We're trying to get her siblings. We thought she would come tonight, but she didn't. She has a new girlfriend. But anyway, she went for a job at BMW. She passed the initial interview. She was very excited to be able to pass a drug test for once and get a job.
Yeah.
Feels good. Feels
Yep.
good about herself. She took the manufacturing test and didn't pass it. She's never taken manufacturing.
Okay.
It got her down.
Yeah.
So just trying to take on too much, I think.
Yeah.
At once, and so she just kind of was offered another job, so she's going through that process now, but it's just.
So I don't know if everybody can hear, like, describing a situation where actually, like, jumping back into it perhaps could be, I don't want to say too early, but there are some downsides to that. There are some upsides, which is what? You're trying to get back into the world, you're going to be able to contribute financially, you probably feel better about yourself, you feel okay, but then there's also downsides around, like, if it doesn't work out, and you take a hit, that kind of thing. Now, probably a key part of the process is, and with her story, if she's in a partial hospitalization program and an IOP program, those are intensive group therapy sessions. If a person's in groups or they have an individual counselor, what you would want to do as a family member is try to encourage them to be talking to their support groups about these frustrations and about these issues. If there's one single thing that I could give to a person seeking recovery, it would be a willingness to talk about their issues to their support groups. Even let's pretend you can't wave a magic wand and guarantee somebody's not going to use. Let's take that off the table. The single most important thing would be whatever your chosen path, whatever that is, AA, NA, favor, PHP, going to an individual therapist, you use those people and you talk to them about the ins and outs and the strife and the stress, and because the family can't be the main go-to for that, guys. You can't be on the hook for those conversations with your loved one. I'm a therapist, and I can't be on the hook for those conversations with a loved one because it's what? It's too emotional. It's too close. I can be on the hook for what? Support, encouragement. You can do it, but I can't be the one that's saying that's sitting in a room with a person while they. My daughter's telling me I feel like a piece of crap because I didn't get this job, and then really try to work that out with her. That needs to be their support group. You can offer that support, but if you can. So as you're going through this, the other part of the question of how long do you support them financially or what do you do, maybe that's also a question that they bring up with their support group. Or if they have a therapist that maybe they have a family therapist that you could actually go with and have that conversation. You guys get that part of it. You don't have to figure all this out yourself if they have somebody that they're involved with. All right, so we talked about this last time and we just mentioned it. You got to be on the same page. You got to be, especially parents, you got to be reading from the same sheet of music. And this is just different things that get in the way of that. At the top of the pyramid are the techniques and the rules and the curfews and what time they have to come in and who they're allowed to hang out with and what we do if they use in our house, we kick them out. That's the top. We like to talk that, but the thing that gets in the way are all these things. The first thing is each parent has to believe that the other parent wants the best for the person and that they love the person and they care. You guys get that? Now you're saying to yourself, you're saying self, that's ridiculous. I've been in many situations where one of the parents thought the other parent did not have their child's best interest in heart. If you think that, then you don't even need to have that parent involved. Or you're going to have a really hard conversation because you're never going to be able to agree on this if you think this. If you don't think this. Do you guys get that? And you're going to have to get that worked out. Why? Because what you think will leak out in every conversation and every interaction that you have. These are stressful times that you're dealing with, right? And if I think that my wife isn't a good mom and doesn't really actually care about the welfare of my daughter, and I'm trying to work out what time curfew is, what's going to happen? My attitude is going to come through in that, and it's going to blow up in this argument and fight. It's not going to lead to any kind of productive, on the same page type conversation. So you got to have that. You also have to have mutual respect for one another when you're talking about this. You got to have a way to kind of get through this, even if you don't agree. You have to give each other time off. You can't. One person should not be running the show. And then you get to the stuff up here. What time do they have to be in? What are our expectations when they come back from rehab? This is for parents, guys. This is for parents. Now, where spouses are concerned or other situations that might be more complicated, you have to try to figure out who needs to be there. And let's pretend this target right here is the addicted person. You have to make sure that the closer the person is to the addicted person, the more likely they have to be involved in these conversations. Do you guys understand that part? Classic example would be what? Mom and dad are coming to family group, but wife doesn't care and doesn't come. How much influence or how much momentum will the mom and dad get if wife thinks everything's cool? Do you guys get this? So one of the things you can start doing if you're here in Greenville and you can make this meeting regularly and keep coming is start to think, who else should be at this family group and how do we get them here? One of the interesting things that keeps coming up, not just here at Favor, but in other conversations that we're having, that I've been having around the nation, quite frankly, is what do you do? What do you do whenever there's one member of the family who just won't move? You guys, maybe you can relate to that. You got what? You got one member of the family who just what? Doesn't think it's a problem, or maybe they're just really, really uncomfortable with confronting it. And you have other members of the family who are this is an issue, we got to do something about it, but the one member of the family who doesn't want to confront it is the most influential member. And you might have to do an intervention on that person in order to do an intervention on that person. Or shoot them. That's recorded, Julia. I disavowed myself from what you just said.
Sorry.
So, yeah, that's part of the conversation, guys. And we've talked in here before about how do you get somebody to come to a family group and learn more about this issue if they're just dead opposed to it. And honestly, guys, we haven't found a good solution to that yet. We haven't found a good solution on how do we actually get that person to come. And this is where you'd have to try to, and when I say an intervention to get a person to come do an intervention, I actually mean it. You almost have to have the family members that are down put pressure on the person who's resistant. This also becomes a problem whenever the family members are coming, but maybe they're not ready to take action. And it's been going on and on and on. Sometimes you have to put pressure on the family member to make a move. Guys, here's what's going to happen. As you go through this, depending on what level this situation is and how big the crisis is, you're going to get to some really, really difficult spots. You're going to get some really crossroad situations where it's basically going to be like you're going to be looking at each other, and the only thing that you can do is go downstairs and have a conversation and say, listen, we're not doing this anymore. You're no longer living in the basement. You follow me? Like, and you'll call favor, and we will support you through that, and we will listen, and we will pat you in the back, and we will cry with you, and we understand it, but there is no other answer. Do you guys get that? And here's the reason I'm saying this, because people call us, and where we struggle with favors, we want to be so loving and so kind that I'm starting to wonder if sometimes we send people the wrong message. Because sometimes people will call and they will ask the same question over and over again. My son's in the basement, he's smoking crack, he stole the car last week, what do we do? Ma'am, you're going to have to think about an intervention. You have to get him out of the basement. You're going to have to set some boundaries. I don't think I can do that. And it goes on for 6 or 7 or 8 months. At some point in time, there are just really, really, really difficult things that are going to have to be done in this process. Now, we have your back no matter what. We have your back and we support you through that, and we know that you're going to have to figure that out on your time. Do you get that? But I really want to let you know that that's unfortunately the hard edge of this sometimes, right? Now, here's something that I do want to go on the record. You don't ever, in my opinion, have to completely disengage from the person unless they are abusive to you. So even if you have to, even if you have to say to somebody, you can no longer stay in my house because of X, Y, and Z, it doesn't mean you have to disconnect. You'll hear people say, then you shouldn't have anything to do with them. You should disengage completely. You shouldn't even talk. That's just not true. You can talk on the phone. You can talk about the weather. You can even talk about, do you want help? That kind of stuff. It's just when the boundaries have to start to be discussed.
What's the GF phenomenon?
Oh, I call it the girlfriend phenomenon. Okay, so this is a situation. This is just, you got the dude. He's 26. All right. He's living with his girlfriend, or maybe he's living at mom and dad's house and going to girlfriends a lot, and mom and dad think it's a huge problem, but he sort of knows in the back of his head he can move out with his girlfriend, and she's cool with it. And unfortunately, she's the most important person in your life. Now, also, parents in the room. Parents in the room. Do you realize that as your children become teenagers, you are no longer the most important people in their life? Take advantage of, these kids are this age. I'm not sure what age it is. 13 or 14, you go from being one of the smartest people on the planet to one of the dumbest. And it doesn't change until they have kids of their own. So let's understand something. That is a natural development kind of thing. And so if you're waiting for a scenario where they're going to kind of listen to you because you're mom and dad and they should listen to mom and dad and they're 43, you want to reconsider that strategy. It's not working. And so that's just a natural part of the process, and that's why this says girlfriend phenomenon. It could be, really what it means is, are you identifying the right people who need to be in this conversation? How do you know who the right people are, and are you getting them on the boat, because you're not going to get much done if you don't? Typical situations are like girlfriends, but it also, wives, that kind of thing. Sometimes friends, believe it or not. Sometimes friends need to be involved with that. Sometimes employers. We've had situations where employers have had to be involved. But do you guys get the general idea? And then this is an extreme kind of statement here, but in general, what you tend to have in situations where you're trying to get on the same page within a family system, family broadly defined, right? Important people, you have different ends of the spectrum. You're just going to have different opinions on the same thing. One person's going to look at it and they're going to see it. This is just DEFCON 5. I can't believe this. Things are getting worse. Another person can look at the same situation and say what? Yeah, this is actually better than it was a year ago. He's moving in the right direction. She's moving in the right direction. That's perception. It also sometimes is driven by other issues like fear, and I'm going to talk about guilt and shame and things like that and how that feeds into it. But you're going to have to work through those two different types of ideas and kind of come to some compromises, talk about how we're going to go and where we're going to move forward with this. Defining what you want to focus on with the boundary is very important. What's the issue that you need to see change for your life right now? That's different depending on the situation. If a person's actively using in your house, the target is probably what? Get some help. If the person just came back from rehab and they seem to be doing okay, but you're worried because they're talking to old friends. The target might be something more about like, let's get, continue your groups and stay away from old friends. You get this? This is very different for different people. It's not the same. But you have to take a minute and identify what's the target before you can have a conversation. You have to be focused. You have to be focused in the middle of a situation that by definition is chaotic. How many people here have ever watched the show Ozarks? Okay, the dude, Marty Bird. Have you ever noticed how phenomenal Marty Bird is at being focused in the middle of chaos? You need to harness your Marty Bird skills. And if you haven't checked out Ozarks, watch it. You'll see what I'm talking about. Addiction and addiction-related crises are just laden with fear, anger, all kinds of emotion, tears, anxiety. You get really, really jacked up. You start saying things to the person that you don't necessarily mean. It comes out of your mouth. You want to take it back. Then what happens? The person gets escalated themselves. You just wanted to have a conversation about what time they needed to be in. Or you just wanted to have a conversation about why aren't they going to their group therapy sessions. That's all you wanted to do. Next thing you know, you're screaming at each other. And they're heading out the door, jumping in the car, and you're there all night. How many people have been up all night waiting for somebody to come back or waiting for somebody to respond to a text message? You guys who aren't raising your hand, come on, you all know you have. Can I get an amen? Amen! I always wanted to do that, yeah. Wait, and it's gone from this conversation where you just sort of thought like we're going to lay some stuff out to this whole other level. Why does that happen, guys? How does it? First of all, can anyone relate to that? Has anybody found themselves in a conversation with a loved one that you just wanted to have a talk and it wound up something else? Has that happened to other people in here? What happens? Anybody have any theories or ideas on why that goes down that way? I mean, I tell you, like, I'm talking like I'm going in and I'm going to talk to her or him, my son or daughter, and I'm going to say that in my head, I'm going to say this, and then I'm talking like 30 seconds in, I'm up here saying all kinds of crazy stuff. I know every cop in the city of Pittsburgh, and I'm going to have you and your freaking boyfriend under surveillance. Okay? Who do you think you are? You don't even trust me. Out the door. And then you're like, how did that even happen? So what are your theories on why that goes down? So there's some underlying emotions involved. There's some. So her comment was fear. There's this underlying thing. So you're not walking into the conversation actually in the best space. On a scale of 1 to 10, you're already at a 7. So maybe what you want to do is you sort of want to say you want to monitor and try to figure out how do you get down to a 3 before you go into the conversation. What else?
They were going to manipulate.
Okay, the idea that the person's going to try to manipulate you. And the idea that you need to be in control of the situation. And that the person needs to do what you want them to do. Do you guys get that? Because with an addict or an alcoholic, if their lips are moving, they're lying. Have you heard that?
Exactly.
All that stereotypical stuff, you want to put it out of your head, guys. Not because you want to try to give somebody a break, but because it's going to influence the way you respond, and it's going to turn into what I just said, because you're allowing all those societal messages to kind of come into the room with you. It has nothing to do with your particular situation. Do addicts and alcoholics manipulate? Yes, but were there a lot of times when I was actively using that I was telling the truth and I was a stand-up dude? Yes. Yes, all the stuff that you've been told about addicts are constitutionally incapable of telling the truth, it's just not true. We tend to kind of like go around the world doing our thing, and then when we're in the middle of our moments, we will lie, we will cheat, we will do things to support our habit, but that's not who we are at our core. Do you guys get that? That's whenever the brain is driving the ship. So try to not go, I'm so glad you said that about manipulation. Try to not go into the conversation with any preconceived ideas. Also, maybe you go into the conversation with the addicted person and you're willing to even hear them out. That is counterproductive. I mean, that is counterintuitive. You've been told not to do this. I'll tell you a story real quick that illustrates this. So at Favor Greenville, we use a intervention model called ARISE, which is a very person-centered, invitational intervention model. You guys have seen the show Intervention probably, where they surprise the person. You guys know what I'm talking about? That horrible A&E intervention show where they follow the addicted person around, they exploit the addicted person, and then they confront them and send them to rehab. That's probably the way you've thought about interventions. We don't do it that way. The person knows we're meeting and we know they're talking about them, and we invite them to the intervention. There's no surprises. And everybody says, well, they won't come. They've come 100% time. I've never had anybody not come to one of my interventions. 100% of the time the person is shown. They're not going to let you get together and talk about them without them being there. Do you follow it? You get it? So I had this conversation. This guy called, and I think he actually might have been calling about his brother, now that I think about it. I'm not saying this because you said this, because you said you're a sibling. He called, and he wanted to know, would I do an intervention? He wasn't even from Greenville. It would have been an out-of-town, get-paid intervention. And so I explained to him how we do it. And I said what I just said to you guys. And you know what he said? He said, I don't think I like that. And you know what I said to him? I said, you want to extract a pound of flesh, don't you? And you know what he said to me? Yes, I do. And I said, I can get you, hold on, I'll get you a phone number for somebody who hates addicts, and you can get that done. And I gave him this person's phone number, and I'm sure that they did a very punishing, in-your-face, confrontational, shameful intervention. That's the mentality that we got to be careful of. Not because we want to give the person a break, but because you guys don't want to lose your mind. If you fight it like that, guys, if you believe what I showed you with the brain, if you fight the person tooth and nail with this, you're actually playing ball in their ballpark. When I was out there in active addiction, I was in my element when I was fighting with people. Do you guys get that? Chaos, screaming, yelling, storming out. Things got weird for me, and my behavior started to change when people started to change the way they were acting toward me, because it freaked me out. Why is she not arguing with me? Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have your boundaries and you don't stick to them. It just means you don't need to stick to them in a confrontational way. You guys get that? It's not the message, it's how you deliver the message. The message can stay the same. What else? Anybody else have any other suggestions or things that might get in the way of a productive conversation? Anything else they would throw out there for the group in terms of suggestions?
Cell phone.
Carol?
I think that what I would think would help would be at least have one boundary plan, one little.
So you got to have a target you're walking in with.
Yeah, one
Yep.
little thing that you know you can make it through that and win them over.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the target. Now, this will be formulated in a curriculum and a package at our family training starting this week. So, guys, what we're doing at Favor is we're developing a brand new kind of like protocol around this issue. And identifying the target is definitely part of the protocol. You got to know what you're going in there to try to say. You have to. Yes, Mary Kay.
I remember once you told us how important it was that if you, like you talked about, setting that time, that boundary for when you're coming in, that kind of thing, that you pointed out it wasn't a boundary and trying to control them, it was to explain to them how it's going to affect you. If they don't come in when you need them to.
Right.
You're going to be up all night, you have to work the next morning. This really isn't about you, it's about me.
So it goes back to the way that it goes back to the way you're presenting the message, right? So I can tell somebody that they got to be in at 1 o'clock in the morning in several different ways, 2 different ways primarily. One is, Linda, you got to be in at 1 o'clock in the morning. That's your curfew. That feels like what? Control.
Angry.
That kind of thing.
You're angry at
Or I could say, Linda, can I talk to you for a minute? Listen, I can't sleep until you get in. You're living here. I know you're an adult. You're 22 years old, 32 years old, 52 years old, whatever it is. And I know this has nothing to do. This has nothing to do with whether or not I trust you. It has nothing to do with whether or not I can control you. I simply can't sleep until you come in. Can you come in at 1 o'clock? And then if she comes in at 1:15, you don't blink an eye. You get this? Like you're trying not to set. But again, it's counterintuitive. It's very counterintuitive to what we've been taught. And there might be situations where you can't do it that way. There might be situations where you just got to get hardcore. Now, those are the attitudes that can influence communication the wrong way. Here's some other just general stuff, basic stuff around communication. Try to talk about this issue on an ongoing basis rather than only when the crisis is going on. Check-ins. Maybe check-ins with the other people who it's affecting. Talk about it. Come to this group. Don't wait until it's hitting the fan to actually do something about this. Otherwise, what? You're just going to be chasing your tail over and over again. You're going to be running on a treadmill over and over again. It's not about winning. We already talked about that. You're allowed to. Who cares? It's about, is the person moving toward recovery? Identify the target. Prepare to compromise. Be careful where you get outside info and advice. You're dealing with a very stressful situation. You're not going to deal with it well if you're talking to people who are telling you that you're the world's worst enabler. If you're talking to neighbors who say, if that was my kid, I would, he'd be out on his ear. First of all, they're not telling you the truth. Because if it was their kid, there would be a reason why they can't kick him out. He's left-handed. Can't kick him out. Your kid's right-handed. Kick him out. Armchair quarterbacks. Have anybody heard the term armchair quarterbacks? Armchair quarterbacks, and if there are any armchair quarterbacks out there in Facebook land, armchair quarterbacks, there's no place for them. And then here's the other one. If there are people out there who do not have kids, who want to give you advice on what to do with your kids, you want to terminate that relationship before you terminate them. Okay? So, and why are you doing that? That's because you want to try to not let that into your system. If you have that all in your system, you're going to be more and more emotional, you're going to be more and more upset, and that's going to influence the way you interact with the person. Try to be kind to each other. Here's the basics. Somebody said this. Put away the phone. Put away the phone. Oh my God, where's my phone? Oh. What the hell is wrong with me? I cannot believe that just happened. I literally almost panicked. I didn't know where my phone was. I went into like a momentary panic, and it's right there.
I've never seen you blush like that.
That's ridiculous. All right. So put away the phone. How about this? How about your tone of voice and your body language, right? Like the way you say things have a lot to do with it. Avoid blaming people. Listen to learn, don't listen to respond. Listen to learn is really when the person's talking, you're actually paying attention. And this is communication, maybe with the person who's addicted, but also with other people who need to be helping with the situation. Get some support if you need to. Try to close the conversation with a next step. Even if it is, hey, we're going to get together again next week just to check in. Or I'll give you a call later on. This is something you might want to do with your loved one who's going through this. And it might just be, we'll meet next week for dinner, that kind of thing. Remember, no is a complete sentence. Right?
Rich, I just want to say
Yes.
one thing. Those 12 rules they should be the 12 rules for communications
Period.
outside of addiction.
Period.
And like,
Yeah. Yeah. If you go into any interaction with that kind of thinking, you're likely for it to go better. That kind of thing. They say that there's three different ways. There's three different points involved when you're trying to communicate. There's what you have in your head and what you want to say to the person. So you formulate what you want to say. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is what you actually say, which might be different than what you thought. And then the third thing is what they actually hear. So clear communication is much easier said than done. And being clear on that and bringing down your emotion is exceedingly important in those situations.
What worked best for me was bringing down the emotions before I even had that conversation, even if it meant waiting a day or two. I had to sit on things a lot.
Yeah.
And it took some practice.
Yeah.
But it
Absolutely.
was better for me.
Absolutely. The other thing that I should say, and this really isn't one of the 12 rules, I forgot to mention this when we were talking about what are the things that get in the way, or what are the attitudes that get in the way. The other thing I wanted to talk about was be careful of prophesizing the future. And be careful of having all these different scenarios in your mind on how things are going to work out for your loved one. And that's usually bad. that's usually like a series of bad options, and here's how it's going to go. He's going to relapse. He's going to wind up in jail, or even worse, he could wind up dead. Try to not have that in your mind. Just focus on the moment. Just focus on what's going on in the moment, and focus on what's going on today. And don't spend a lot of time saying he did this before, and the past is a predictor of the future. Do you guys get that? What is the, and again, I got to tell you, Marty Bird, I'm going to write a blog post on, because it's really like, what is going on in the moment? What am I dealing with today? I mean, here's the truth, guys, about recovery. Do you know that 46% of people who find long-term recovery get it without any identified professional support or even a support group? In other words, they figure it out. They figure it out. Now, what has happened in our world today is we've had these different harder core substances enter the picture, which is, it's raised the stakes, right? So I get that. But we don't want to paint a picture in our mind that, like, we know how this is going to wind up. So-and-so is going to wind up in jail. You guys get this? Get that out of your mind. All right. So what gets in the way of saying no? If we can all agree that this is the case, no. Saying no is a complete sentence. You're allowed to say no. What gets in the way? Well, there's several different things, but the two I want to talk about tonight, well, the two I was going to highlight tonight is fear and guilt. I think that those are two of the biggest things. Fear for sure. I'm going to talk a little bit more about guilt and also shame. A couple other things. We can get bullied in any given situation. A person can just overtake us, and we wanted to say no, and next thing you know, we're giving them $100 because what? They just couldn't deal with it anymore. They overwhelmed us. And we want to be loved. Right? We want to be loved. We don't want the person mad at us. We don't want to have unrest.
Not me, I'm over that. They can be mad.
There you go. Amen. Amen. You get a point where, like, I don't care, man. However you feel, you feel. Well, if you're good at saying no, then this might not apply. If you're not so good, you start thinking, like, what kind of gets in the way for you personally? What gets in the way for you personally? Like, again, one of the top ones is fear. Just straight up fear. I'm afraid what's going to happen, because you kind of think, like, if I keep them on the hook or I help them out, at least I know what's going on. And then again, guilt is the second most common. Now remember, I just throw this up because I like this picture. Take a minute and look at that picture. Right? The other thing that we have going on around guilt and shame, I'm about to talk about guilt and shame, is this idea that as a spouse or as a parent, we just weren't good enough because everybody else's life is just perfect in today's fake book world. Look at that picture. See what's going on here? All this, everything's wonderful. It's a freaking trap house behind her. And that's how it is. So, all right, guilt. A feeling of having committed a wrong or failed an obligation. So if you take a minute and you think about how this might apply to your situation and where would guilt come in. I think the obligation or committing the wrong that kind of comes into this process would be what? I didn't do a good enough job? Or I wasn't a good enough spouse? When you start to look at it through this lens, you start to see the ridiculousness of guilt. Would you guys agree with that? That you didn't cause this situation. Is it that, first of all, is there even a scorecard for being a parent? We'll talk about being a parent for a minute. Does anybody even know how the hell to do the parenting thing? I've shared it here before. I got 7 kids, right? So I got Aiden at 5. Eventually, I'll get it right with him.
By the
You
time
know?
you figured it out, you've already worked yourself.
I'll be
up.
dead. You know, I mean, how do you actually know? And even then, have you ever known anyone that you looked at and maybe you knew them really, really well and you feel like they did do everything right? They did follow the book, and Johnny still wound up having these problems? Susie still wound up having these problems? Parenting is an inexact science. A very inexact science. That's done differently around the world. That's done different in different cultures. It's handled differently. There's a lot of different factors that come into it. The social situations outside of the family have a lot to do with it. Do you believe kids have different personalities? If you have more than one child, do they have different personalities?
Yes.
Are there some people that are born as impulsive risk takers? How about that? Have you?
Yes.
So that's a fact. Some people are just more prone to kind of taking a chance. Some people run into certain people and that kind of helps them along the way.
Chemical, physical makeup.
Yeah, exactly, like the person's makeup. that kind of thing. And so this idea of failing in a commitment, when you say, I feel guilty, when you start, when somebody says, set a boundary, do something about this, and in your mind you say, I feel guilty, I can't do that. Actually think of this definition and really say to yourself, does this actually apply? And try to start challenging that. Any comments on that definition? We'll get into a couple more. All right, a little bit more about guilt. Guilt and shame go together, right? And an excessive rumination on guilt. Rumination means repetitive thinking. You can ruminate on anything. Excessive rumination on guilt has shown a connection, a correlation to depression. It's kind of like one of the hallmark signs or signposts where depression is concerned. So what I'm telling you here, if you want to beat yourself up long enough, you will find yourself depressed. And what I mean by depressed is like real deal depression, not just a little bit sad. What do I mean by that? Not being able to get out of bed, losing your appetite, suicidal thinking, hopelessness. Guilt has to be dealt with, guys. It has to be looked in the eyes, and you have to confront it, and you have to try to move through this and challenge some of the irrational thinking. All right, let's go through a couple things in terms of types of guilt. So let's start with the obvious. There are certain things that you should be guilty about in life. You may have done something with your child or not been there for this or not been there for that, and you made a mistake that you can feel guilty about. You guys get that? That doesn't mean you have to feel guilty that they became an addict. This is that's a natural thing that occurs inside human beings so that what? We don't do it again. So I have a lot of guilt around my first three children. I have 26, 23, and a 20-year-old. And I guess at the time they would have been 8, 5, and 2 when I was in active addiction. Okay? And I have guilt about that because I did do things that were wrong. I drove with my kids in the car one time completely strung out in pills and was in an accident. I probably wasn't present the way that I needed to. You get where I'm coming from? But that doesn't mean that if one of my kids develop a problem with addiction, that it was my fault and I should feel guilty about them being addicted because my doing something wrong led to this. There are a heck of a lot of people who have gone through a lot worse things like that didn't wind up addicted. You get where I'm coming from? I mean, short of me actually giving the person drugs, do you follow me? You probably don't need to go there in your mind. So it's okay to feel guilty about certain moments and kind of reflect and say, man, I wish I would have done that better. That's actually probably a healthy way to be. Do you guys understand? That's the way we improve. But to paint with this broad brush, I'm guilty, this is my fault, it's because I did it wrong. That's type 1, when we do something that we should feel guilty. Then there's type 2, where we feel guilty about what we didn't do, which is a little bit harder to deal with because it's nebulous. Type 1 is I had this incident. I was driving the kids, they were in the car, we had an accident. That's okay, I got it, there it is, let me look at it, shouldn't have done that, move on. Okay? Type 2 is I wasn't there for them, or I should have been there more often, or I should have been there at the prom, or I should have been there, I should have been there at graduation. You get where I'm coming from? It's a little bit harder to define. Maybe I'm not giving good examples, but do you guys understand the point? Mm-hmm. This one, if this is something that's in your mind, this one will eat you up because you might not even know that you're experiencing it. You might not even know that. Are you sending yourself some kind of message because you weren't, you were a working mom and you weren't there enough when they were young, and we know that that's what happens. Or you worked too much as a father, and or maybe you weren't understanding enough as a spouse. Do you get where I'm coming from? This is a tough one, and you have to challenge kind of the again, unless it's completely obvious, the irrational aspects of type 2 type guilt. That's going to be harder to identify. Type 3 even gets squirrelier. You're guilty because of what you think you did. You screwed them up. You screwed them up because, you know, that one time, if you look at, let's look at the examples there. It's magical thinking. You think you have more power over the person than you do. You think because you didn't do something wrong, they wound up engaging in this behavior. You think because you sent them over to your new neighbor's house and they met your new neighbor's son, and he happened to be a drug user, and this wound up being his first introduction to drugs, that you did it. Do you follow me? And that is not an actual connection that you can make. Those are dots that you cannot connect, but in your mind you do. Linda, you look puzzled. You got it?
I'm just trying to get it.
Yep.
Get it.
You know, this is completely 100% illogical. This is irrational thinking. You want to look at this and say, is this what's driving you? Are you having that type of thoughts? Is what, you know, that example I just gave about you sent your kid across the street to visit the new neighbors. Yes.
One of the things I learned at rehab was there's nothing you can say or do that will make them use. It
Yes.
may make them want to use, but that's on them.
Yeah, Mary Kay and I've talked about that a lot. She said there's nothing you can do to make the person use. And their recovery or their addiction is not dependent on you. It's not your fault. Their success in recovery is not your responsibility. Mary Kay?
Before are you scared when your loved one or your child is in the midst of, you know, really heavy addiction? For me, I knew I wasn't the cause. I didn't have a problem with that. But what I had a problem with is, well, if I set this boundary or if I don't do this, I can make him, you know, stumble even further.
Yeah.
I mean, and it wasn't until I learned about.
Well, if I don't do it right.
That you taught me.
Yeah.
Nothing that I did would make him go use, you know, 10
Yeah.
times more than he did the day before.
Yeah. And I think that what you're talking about, Mary Kay, to a certain extent relates to type 4 guilt, which is I didn't do enough or I'm not doing enough. You know, or if I got to find a way to deal with this other than the boundaries because I got to do this the right way, because if I do it the wrong way, it's going to end up bad. And this leads to a phenomenon you see with parents all the time and with spouses all the time. You get burned out. How many people here have ever felt like they were burned out on this issue? You know what I mean by burned out? I'm done. I can't take another day of this. I want out of this thing. You just feel exhausted and fatigued. You start to suffer serious consequences yourself. You can't sleep at night. You can't concentrate at work. You're getting sick. You're getting physically sick yourself. You're getting run down. You have to step back and kind of like work on, this is where taking care of yourself is very, very important, but this is also where kind of like getting in touch with some of the stuff that we just talked about, that this isn't your responsibility to fix, guys. And the truth is there's nothing that you can do to control this situation. If you could get your loved one into sustained recovery, you would have done it already. You would have done it already. And Favor Greenville would not exist. Because you would, whatever it took, you would have gone and gotten it. You would have made sure they got it. You would have said it. You would have done it. So this isn't something that you can control. Yes?
I was dealing with guilt really bad one time, and I was going to my therapist, and I was talking about, I said, I feel so guilty about such and such, and she said, Carol, you gotta remember this, you did the best you could at the time.
Yeah.
In the space and place that you were, you did the best you could.
Right.
And she really lifted a burden for me to
Right.
say that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, the guilt will kind of like, if you're not paying attention to it, it'll also just start running. Like a lot of times guilt will be subconscious. You won't even necessarily know that it's there and it's influencing you and, you know, it's sort of ruining your day. It'll kind of run the show. Type 5 guilt is different. This is survivor's guilt. So that's not part of it. Then there's shame, right? Shame is deeper. It's almost like humiliation. Guilt can kind of get you moving. Shame will disable you. You know, shame gets to a core of a person. And this would be, shame would come a lot because of the way you're thinking about the situation. And it goes deeper than I didn't do it right. It goes to what? I'm a horrible parent. And it goes different than I could have done better as a spouse to what? I'm a horrible person. Do you guys follow this? This is where good people don't suffer this issue. Good people don't go through these things. This will destroy you. This will destroy you. It's different than guilt. And so, what do we need to pay attention to, or kind of like what happens that kind of leads to that? The first is self-awareness. You know that people are judging you. How many people have felt judged? And what I'm saying is that there's a natural process for feeling shame around this issue. Do you guys get where I'm coming from? And if you don't guard against it, you will feel it because the rest of the world is judging it. Stigma, addicts, that kind of thing. So you become aware that the world is judging you. How do you become aware of that? How do you become aware that the world is judging this issue? Well, first of all, whenever your son or daughter, husband or wife is diagnosed with addiction, does anybody bring you a casserole? Probably not, right? What do? They tend to maybe stay away a little bit. All of a sudden, the kids aren't allowed to come over for a play date anymore.
Talk about you a lot.
They talk about it a lot. They talk about you a lot, that kind of thing. And you become aware that that's going on. And what's it do? It starts to eat away at you. It starts to eat away at you. Then you start to blame yourself.
You need to get just pissed off.
You got to get pissed off. And you got to understand something, that all these people, these freaking people that want to judge us, they want to judge me for being a person in long-term recovery and what I went through. Or they want to judge my kid because he or she went through this. And they want to sit back and tell me how their son and daughter just enrolled in the Harvard, checkers club and is, a Chinese freaking ambassador and has just got a fellowship for neurosurgery. I don't give a shit. Because here's what I know. You got all kinds of skeletons in your closet, freakazoid, and your kids, you got me all fired up, Mary Kay. And your kids have all kinds of skeletons in their closet. And I'll tell you how I know it, guys. One of the perks of being a therapist is you get to know all that stuff. And you get to know, and in my case, I've been a therapist to the beautiful people. Do you follow me? I've been a therapist to the people where the houses all look right, and the kids are graduating when they're supposed to graduate, and everything went perfect, and Susie was great, and Johnny. I've been a therapist to those families. I made a living being a therapist to those families. And let me tell you, that was some of the... I'll say it this way. Those were some of the most challenging cases I've ever been part of. Okay? So this whole idea of don't cast a stone. I'm sorry for swearing. I'm sorry, kids. And,
we're not.
Okay.
Me too.
Okay, all right, good,
I'm
good.
gonna be honest.
All right. And so that idea of don't, if you're in a glass house, don't throw stones or however, that's so true. People have no room to talk. And I'm telling you, you've got to guard against that. And if you have people like that in your life, even if they're family, because sometimes they're family, you want to try to find a way to limit those interactions. The holidays will be coming up before we know it. And there will be people in my family who I will not be around. I will not be around. And you know what I'll do? Freaking awesome at maneuvering that stuff. I've used my powers of manipulation to get that done. There'll be things that I got to do on certain days because certain people are there. You know what I mean? And because I just won't deal with it. I will not suffer it. I will not suffer that type of stuff. I went through that. I went through that for I tell you, when I went through it was with my own recovery. I was laden with shame because this is 18 years ago. Stigma was not even discussed as something we needed to get through. I was working in the field and I wouldn't even tell people I was in recovery. You guys get that? It's so ironic that I'm in a program that is just blowing up stigma when it ran my life for probably the first 3 or 4 years of my recovery. And so I know what it's like to be. And then I went through it with my kids. But I've gotten to a point where there's only one situation where I'm a little bit kind of like jammed up about talking about my story, okay? And it's one of those circumstances. Have you ever been in a circumstance, you probably have, where you have to do a play date with your kids, and it's like you don't even necessarily like the people that you're hanging out with, but your kids like their kids? And you're first meeting them, and they're like, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a nonprofit director. Oh, really? Where at? Favor Greenville. Oh, what's that? Well, that sounds neat. What's that stand for? Faces and Voices of Recovery. Oh, recovery from what? Addiction-related issues. Wow. Now, how'd you get into that? Now, at that point, I'm at a crossroads, right? Because it's not about me. It's about what's going to happen. Are my kids still going to be able to hang out, right? That's when I usually say, oh, I'm an addict in recovery. What time are you going to be home? I need to steal your big screen TV. It's the only situation where I get a little jammed up because it's not about me. It's about will my kids get judged. But if you get in touch with the idea that we all have a cross to bear, and those of us in this room have identified what it is, and we may have other crosses to bear as well. I will tell you this though, having gone through a major health crisis and gone through a major behavioral health crisis, I'm going to tell you the difference between the two psychologically. There's something dynamically different about the idea of this disease, this behavioral health disease, not involving the person in a definitive treatment where they're like laying in a hospital bed. I'm telling you, there's something different. My son could have died. Much more likely that my son was going to die than my daughter. Do you guys follow me? Mm-hmm. But this was more anxiety producing than this because he was there and he was getting his treatment and you could see it. Do you guys follow me? You could see it. And if it worked, you were watching it. You get where I'm coming from? It was right there. It was working. This behavioral health stuff is so squishy, right? They're out in the world. They're doing their thing. They're either going to meetings. It's actually like any other disease, though, right? The medicine is either working or it's not. It's just this over here is so much more. It was so much more tangible for me, even though this was more dangerous. Do you guys get that? Like this was actually like more likely to cause my child to die than this was. Dramatically more likely. But neither one. You get where I'm coming from? Neither one of them were comfortable. But this one I couldn't even, and I think that's what it's about, guys. I think what it is it's just like, and the person doesn't want it, right? The person doesn't want it. When my son's laying in the bed, he's not saying, I don't want this, get the F away from me.
Right.
Yes?
And I remember you sharing that, how you got all this information and all the doctors and the nurses were telling you.
Every time they came in, they told me exactly what was going on.
Everything, what was going to work,
That's a great point. Every single time one of these doctors or nurses came in the room, they said, here's exactly what's happening. Here's what we give them, this is what we think. That's also not going on where addiction's concerned.
Right, that'll tell you.
You get to hear anything, and the family doesn't know at any given time whether it's moving in the right direction or it isn't.
Right.
That's another great point. So I think that's why it's so much harder for us to understand that this is actually like a disease or a disorder.
I just wanted answers to my questions.
Yeah. Yep.
I didn't want to be sent away from the emergency room when we had him taken in.
Yeah.
That we didn't even get talked to.
It's so difficult, guys, and we have such a far way to go as a society. We have so much, and we have to also start to figure out how do we make that feel more like the experience for the person who's going through? How do we make it feel like it's more predictable? And again, knowing that in any of these circumstances, nobody recovers from a physical disease or a mental health / addiction disease 100%. That's not the way the world works, right?
I think your emergency room program is making a big step towards that, though.
Yeah, and I think the idea of communication, so this idea of communication and here's what's going on, we obviously can't tell you what's going on every step of the way, but we believe that through the use of content, through the use of information, given my experience, and I'm not trying to say this as if I know everything about this, but I've done this for a lot of years with a lot of people, that we could start to catalog some of the things that you're going to need to know along the way. That if you gave me any scenario, I could probably start telling you some stuff that's going on with your loved one, even though I don't personally know them or know where they are. I'm telling you, I think I could. And like if they've relapsed, for example. If they've gone to rehab, come out and relapsed, that there's probably a way to give information that the family could feel like I felt like, maybe not quite as definitive, but here's what's going on and here's how we think this could go and here's likely what's happening. But we can't do it with manpower like phone because we just don't have the manpower. That we'd have to get a catalog going. You get that? That's the idea. You just wouldn't have enough people to answer all those questions for everyone. But we would like to be able to create a scenario through the use of technology where you would be able to access that information. You literally could go to a freaking catalog on whatever's happening with your loved one now, and you would get a professionally done set of information on what's happening. And maybe that would help with a situation like that.
My anxiety, that was 1,000, if I'd have had the same ER things that are in place now.
Yeah.
Greenville Memorial would have gone down to a 200.
So what happens in the ER, guys, just so you know why it works in the ER, is because we have a dedicated set of coaches working with a relatively small group of patients. So we're able to provide all this information to only about 136 patients right now. Do you know Favor Greenville has enrolled about 20,000 people? So how do we reach 20,000 people to actually provide that same level of care becomes the issue. And so that's where we start to think, can we automate things, that kind of stuff. Because here's the deal, we know for sure that people's phones are like an appendage, because I just freaking panicked like I lost my arm a little bit ago. All right, so it's about, we're about done here tonight. I appreciate everyone being here. Next week will be a regular kind of group. If you haven't been to that, it's an open discussion. Just people bring up topics, it's not a lecture. And then we'll be back here 2 weeks from today for the lecture. I know that this is difficult stuff, guys, but I'm telling you, try to keep coming back to this group, keep learning about this issue, keep praying, keep the faith. People recover. People recover. No one in the world would have thought that I would be standing up here 18 years in recovery. They definitely wouldn't have thought that I'd be up here, trying to be Captain Recovery or anything like that. This is weird for a lot. There's a lot of people on Facebook right now. Is that Rich Jones? God, that's freaking weird. So try to have a faith in that part of the process. All right, a couple other things real quick. We have some cards that I can get you that has our hotline that you can call if you need any additional support as well. All right, so take a minute here. Let's take a second for those still suffering with this disease and for the family members brought this no choice of their own, followed by the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. All right, we are done. Good deal. I'll get you your stuff.